Good afternoon for those of you who have already joined us. I know more people are going to start trickling in, but for now, I'm David, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore, and we are pleased to welcome Tiffany McDaniel to our At Home with Literati series in support of On the Savage Side. A quick webinar overview for our attendees. The chat is closed, but you can keep that chat window open as I'll be dropping links to purchase the book from Literati throughout the event. The Q&A is accessible. And please, we encourage you to submit questions. Live transcription is available on your toolbar as well. And if you're watching us on YouTube later, links to purchase books are in the description. You can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeastern Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd like to thank you for your attendance this afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for being here. And now, allow me to introduce tonight's author. Tiffany McDaniel is an Ohio native whose writing is inspired by the rolling hills and woods of the land she knows. Drawing from her Cherokee heritage, she's a poet, a novelist, and a visual artist. Her debut novel, The Summer That Melted Everything, won the Guardian's Not the Booker Award and the Ohioana Reader's Choice Award. She is the author of Betty, an international bestseller, and a Friends of American Writers Chicago, the Society of Midland Authors, Nautilus Book Award, and Ohioana Library Reader's Choice Award winner. Good afternoon, Tiffany. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so I think to begin, because your book is still relatively new, it came out last Tuesday.
It did.
If you could give our viewers a little bit of an introduction to the book and what it's about, I think that'd be a great place to start.
Yeah, it's a great place. Yeah, so it's inspired by a true crime case out of Chillicothe, Ohio. A few years ago in that town, women had started to disappear. A few of their bodies were discovered in or near the river. And there's some women who are still missing to this day, and the crime remains unsolved. And in my book, I mentioned the original Chillicothe 6, but the crime has actually expanded and includes more victims. So yeah, it was a pretty big crime that happened in this part and still remains unsolved.
Yeah. Wow, that's crazy. I mean, it fits right in with like the sort of cultural moment that true crime is having all over the world. So wow, super topical. So how did you first hear about this case?
So I had, grown up in both South Central and Southern Ohio, and in between those two places was Chillicothe. So it was a place that I frequented ever since I was a kid. And when I started to hear about the crime taking place, there was some sentiment in the community that because the women were linked to addiction and those lifestyles associated with it, that they were somehow expendable or somehow active participants in their murder. And so that really drew me into writing about this story. And then in researching it, I was looking at the photographs of the women, and I recognized one of the photographs as someone I had actually gone to school with. And so I had all these different kind of threads pulling me toward the story. And that's really the origin in terms of how I got involved.
Wow, that's horrifying and fascinating that you knew someone who is involved with it. So it gives you a little bit more personal stakes. So what kind of research went into this? Did you go to Chillicothe?
I did, yeah. So, like I said, I've been there since I was a kid, but going back now and revisiting the places that kind of carried the ghost and the atmosphere of this crime, went back to the paper mill, revisited the Chillicothe Inn where some of the women had last been seen or were known to frequent. There's a photograph within the book of the river, and I had taken that on the overpass where Shasta Hemmerich was last seen alive. And so I revisited these places. I kind of wanted to collect the feeling, collect the atmosphere, and hopefully infuse that enough in these pages, the readers, that really came across for the readers.
And I know it's fiction, but in terms of sources, did you interview any real life people who were involved with this case?
So I did not. So something I didn't want to to do with this book was trespass on the truths of the characters. I felt like the real life victims should have their stories told by those who knew them best, their family and friends. And so, with my previous book, Betty, that was based on a real story. And so, I had interviewed family members for that book. And so, I understood how important it is to keep those strands of story close to someone who had experienced those issues or know those people. So I really didn't want to trespass on the truth of the real life victims in this case. And what was really ended up being inspired by the crime was the violence against women who are in these circumstances. And I do want to say the character is 100% fiction, but I did want to kind of capture the spirit of who these women might have been. I had known women like them in not only my community, but generations in my own family. You know, I had aunts who struggled with addiction. And so it was really something that I wanted to put in on my end, but definitely protect and kind of cocoon the real life stories of the real life victims.
Yeah, I mean that's so great. It's like part of the whenever I see these conversations about true crime or even like novels that are inspired by true crime cases, like there's always this push pull of like, is it respectful to keep going into these things? Is that going to cause more pain in people's lives? So it's cool to hear you talk about it that way. Um, Not just specific to Chillicothe, but growing up in Ohio, how has that influenced your writing in general? And also your writing is so regionally specific, but specifically this book has such a time and a place.
Yeah. Ohio landscape has definitely, been part of my writing portfolio. It's where my first two books took place, and of course, with my previous book, Betty, it was where my mother was raised as well after they migrated to Ohio. And so Ohio was always kind of present, and especially Southern Ohio, which is so different than Central Ohio. You know, Southern Ohio has the hills, and it's in, the foothills of Appalachian, so it carries its own kind of mythic qualities. And especially when we're looking at a place like Chillicothe, you know, when I was a kid and I would go to Chillicothe, I would see this large paper mill, and it's exhaling its smoke, and it really looked like an old dragon sitting there on the edge of town. And so I wanted to carry that same perspective that I had as a kid into this book. And you'll see throughout the book, you'll see the river talking. I really wanted to have almost diary entries from the river, her perspective of what it felt like to have these women's bodies float in her water. I wanted the paper mill to feel like this character that was again breathing over the entire town, and was a big part of especially Ark and Daffy's lives. And so I did really want to infuse that landscape around them into these characters and make it part of their story.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I mentioned to you while we were setting up, is that the river is such a distinct character. What would you say is sort of like, what is the metaphorical importance of the river in terms of how you use that to fuel the narrative?
So I've always lived by a river, and so water has always been very important to me. And I look at nature as a whole as something that has a soul, and the river to me has always been female. And so when I was setting out in this story, you know, we had this whole cast of characters of women who this violence and this crime is impacting, but it's also impacting the river herself. You know, I present her as someone who has known these women ever since they were kids. And so I wanted to have her voice pull through and really unite with this group of women. You know, in the book, this group of women, they call themselves the Chillicothe Queens. We have Sage Nell. She's, a philosopher. She wears this sweatshirt every day, and it's a sweatshirt from college, and it's kind of the last artifact of her previous life before she succumbed to substance abuse. And we have Thursday, she's a character who is, grittier. She goes through the book and she's cutting holes throughout her clothing, and she's really, representing that, is saying that she's losing so many pieces of herself. She's sort of, cutting these dimes out of her clothes to pay the devil. And we have someone like Violet, who is, the mothering, nurturing figure, who's sober when we meet her, and she's trying to survive on this savage side in order to be present for her daughter. And we have Ark and Daffy, who are, the twin sister, and Ark is our narrator. And so I really wanted the river to feel as if she was part of this group that they call themselves the Chillicothe Queens. And hopefully, that's kind of pretty seamless, but the river definitely a big part of their story.
Yeah, so that leads into my next question, actually. Can you talk more about the relationship between the Chillicothe Queens? Like, it's such a strong connection, but what besides them living in the same town draws them together?
Yeah, I really, with this group of women, I really want to make sure that each felt unique and individual, that they had their own complex arc in the book, because when this story first happened, what we saw, the women were their mugshots. We saw kind of unflattering representation. So I really wanted to represent them as mothers, sisters, and daughters. One day their own kids will learn about their mothers and learn about the real life circumstances. So I wanted to have something positive in terms of these women being complex individuals. And, they unite here on the river, and they call their place the Distant Mountainous, where they kind of unite and come together. And remind me what your question was, because then I kind of went off into a different tangent. I completely forgot.
Just I understand that very well.
Yeah.
Just like elaborating on the relationship between them, what besides geography draws them together?
Okay, yeah, and that's where I was leading back to. So so these women, especially Ark and Daffy, I'll start with them. So we see them in the book in their childhood, and I really wanted to show that complete cycle of generational abuse. I'd grown up playing with kids like Ark and Daffy, understood, what it meant to come from households where both of the parents were addicted. And so that was something I really wanted to show with them. And so they're coming from the aspect of generational addiction, and how they come to unite in this group of women is they're all kind of doing these same activities on the street. They're linked to prostitution. They're linked to the same individuals who are frequenting. They're linked to the same dealers. And so they're united in kind of this surface of addiction, and yet they build these deeper bonds with one another. And, in the book, I wanted the women to speak in a language that readers would, of course, understand, but I wanted it to feel unique to them. I wanted to feel like their own language. And so in the book, you'll see that the women speak in very almost like they're myth tellers. They're telling these stories or telling these legends. They find an old abandoned car in the woods, which they call Cleopatra's time machine. And so the women are taking on kind of this language that feels very heightened in terms of the gritty, raw street kind of life around them. And so that was definitely something that bonded them as well, was the way that they interact with each other, the way that they nourish each other. And I think that's so important, to have that nourishment between women who are living in these circumstances and really not taken with a lot of value by the community around them.
Yeah, wow, that's powerful. So that leads me to a question about the structure of the novel and how you open the book when Daffy and Ark are young girls, as opposed to starting the novel with the disappearances. And you sort of build it up into the way they're brought up, the tumult of all that, growing up in a town in a family that's affected by addiction. Can you just speak about why you decided to open the novel that way? Because I feel like the tendency for a lot of people in true crime related things is to go with like the sensational stuff first and then work backwards. And I found it refreshing that these people were humanized. You were able to grow with them as they were growing.
Yeah, I definitely did want readers to feel as if they were growing with Ark and Daffy. They're two kids. They're living in this house with their Aunt Clover, who goes around, saying, "Spittle, spittle, spider, where you gonna find her?" So she has this kind of, this strange quality to her. She's someone who, over the course of the book, will start to collect twigs, and is kind of collecting the pieces of the road around them. And readers will learn what she's sort of creating with these twigs. And then they also live with their mother, Addie, who is severely addicted, and living in the back bedroom on this mattress on the floor. And readers will see her, she's cut a hole in this mattress, and she's taken out all the stuffing and everything. She's sort of filling the mattress with everything that she's collecting from the Johns. And there's a lot of symbolism of artifacts of these women. Ark is a character who really loves history. And so we constantly see her digging and trying to uncover not just herself, but uncover the world around her. And so we see her kind of collecting these artifacts of Chillicothe, and it kind of bleeds over into these other characters. But that was, them coming in this house, and, it had concrete floors. And as kids, they weren't, they didn't have responsible figures in their lives. And so when it came, for example, for their birthdays, they were drawing their birthday cakes on the concrete floor and kind of, giving them their own celebration. And so the entirety of their concrete floor in the house was illustrated with kind of everything that was happening in their life. And I really wanted readers to understand, the aspects of being children in homes where their parents are addicts, the aspect of not having the basics of safety and shelter or even food. We see Ark and Daffy struggling with hunger. And that was something I remember from the kids that I had played with. And so I really wanted readers to understand the circumstances that these kids are coming from. No one starts out in life saying that when I grow up, I want to be an addict or I want to, live this life on the street. And so I really wanted readers to understand the full scope of where these characters are coming from and hopefully, understand how their life took them as young women.
Yeah, that's really refreshing because, people love to latch on to sort of the most sordid or sensational details. And yeah, the way you humanized these people because they are just humans, it's really shouldn't be that revolutionary. And yet, it really struck me. So one other thing that I love about your writing is the visual elements that are in this book. They're a large piece of the storytelling, like the photos of the river, the spiders, the keyholes. What drew you to those images and why were they important to include?
Yeah, so I was, of course, writing this book. I really felt like images added another layer to the story, and it goes back to Ark being a lover of history. And there's a scene in the book where Mama Milkweed sets up her bedroom to look like an ancient Egyptian tomb, and in her bedroom she writes hieroglyphics for Ark and Daffy. And so I wanted these images, the photograph of the river, the image of the keyhole, the image of the spider, to really feel like the hieroglyphics of Ark in these women's lives. And there's a portrait in the book. I had done the watercolor image of Ark's portrait and then, taken it and broken it up. And so first part we see her eye, the second part we'll see her eye and her nose, and so on and so forth. So over the course of this book, it feels like Ark is taking these pieces of herself, building it back together in a more authentic portrait that's truly 100% her.
Yeah. Wow. Love that. You have really good answers. I'm sorry. I sound like
Yeah.
So can you talk about the title, On the Savage Side, and the metaphor in the novel that it's drawn from? Because I thought that was a really cool thing.
Yeah, so on the savage side, there's a character named Mama Milkweed in the book, and she's the grandmother of Ark and Daffy. And she's someone that they really love. She's the one who provides them with the markers for them to draw on the concrete floor of their house. And she's also someone who crochets. And so, she's teaching Ark and Daffy how to crochet, and they're doing this afghan together. And anyone who crochet knows that when you change colors, you have a lot of strings of the yarn hanging off. And so Mama Milkweed tells them, girls, in life, there's a savage side and a beautiful side. And you'll notice the front part of the afghan, it's smooth. There's no loose strings. This is a beautiful side. And then she flips it over to them and she shows them the strings. And she said, and this is the savage side. It's kind of all the monsters that you can think of. But she tells them you can survive the savage side. And so she takes a yarn needle and she starts to weave in the strings. And it's her way of kind of arming the girls with their sword and shield the best way a grandmother knows how, which is through her knowledge and her wisdom, because she understands that her granddaughters are going to face plenty of obstacles in their life. And so she's trying to let them know that this savage side exists, but that they can survive it.
Yeah. And that they, both things exist in life, so you just have to accept it.
Right.
So how long, this is like a more of a crafty question, I guess. How long did it take you to write this book, start to finish?
So people are usually surprised, but it takes me about 30 days to write a novel. Yeah. But I don't like the story to fester too long. So I like to get it out. And, I approach writing a book that's, kind of like the way a body is built. So you lay out your skeleton and then you start to layer on your muscle and your tissue and your fat. And then you're kind of doing the cosmetic work at the end with the skin and the freckles and the moles. And so for me, laying out that skeleton, I really want to do it pretty quickly. So 30 days on average is what I do a novel in.
And do you usually start with just kind of like the germ of an idea, or like you kind of already have like the general outlines of what you want to do accomplish before you start that 30-day process?
So I do not use any outlines ahead of time. I feel like it kind of directs the story a little bit too much. And so I am a longhand writer. And so I go with the notebook and pen, and I just take the story organically from the first line. I always have to have the first line. And then, I go from beginning to end, and that's kind of how it evolves for me. I don't, for some writers, they find outlines really helpful. For me, I just find that it kind of dictates where the story is going. I really want it to just feel, more organic in the process.
Cool. So you've said in interviews, and you said it to me while we were prepping for this, that you have over 20 novels written. How do you decide which one's next? Like, how did you decide this was what should follow Betty?
Yeah, so Betty, we started to discuss some of the themes that are in On the Savage Side. In the case of Betty, it was generational sexual abuse. Across my work, I tend to write with feminist themes. And especially these two books, I felt like there was a solid bridge between the two of them. In Betty, I wrote about my aunts Freya and Flossie, and I took some elements of inspiration from them for the characters of Aunt Clover and Addie. And On the Savage Side, there's a scene in the book between Aunt Clover and Art, where Aunt Clover is saying, I've always wanted to go to France, see the Mona Lisa, but I know I never will. And so that was actually taken from one of the last conversations that I had had with my Aunt Freya. And so I felt like the scenes, between Betty and On the Savage Side were connected by these threads, and it just felt like the next book to follow Betty with.
Yeah. And now I would like to move on to the topic of sort of true crime as a genre. What do you think that fiction based on real life true crime can accomplish that narrative nonfiction, i.e., your, podcasts and documentaries and stuff, can't? What do you think are the advantages and perhaps disadvantages?
So I will say, I love true crime. I'm a Dateline 48 Hours viewer. But my goal with this book was to not hone in on who the killer is or the psychology of the killer. I wanted to really focus on the women, their voices, who they were. And so in the book, we see a cast of suspects. But with this book, I didn't want it to feel like it was a resolution to the case to any of the real life victims. I didn't want to write a book where they felt like I was in some way going to uncover the real killer behind these crimes. And so with this book, it's not focused on the resolution of the case or figuring out who the killer is or the psychology of the killer or kind of going into that backstory. It's really focused on who these women were, how they reacted to this crime happening around them. You'll notice that the suspects in the book, they're not given names. They're called Highwayman or Riverman or, their various John names, but the women's names are all amplified. And so I really wanted to show that, these killers had tried to take these women's names from them. And in the end, the killer's name is stripped from him, and these women's names are really what shine through the pages. And so I think with true crime, having that balance between stories that amplify the voice of the victim while also trying to discover who the killer is, because of course going into the psychology of the killer can in many cases help to discover who the suspects is in real life crimes. But with this particular book, I really wanted to lean on the amplification of the women's voices and not give false hope to the families that this book was going to uncover the killer.
Yeah, I love that answer. And I love how much it is focused on the women specifically. And can you talk a little bit about, I know you were talking in real life, there's also community backlash because a lot of these women suffered with addiction problems and, or were sex workers or, had criminal backgrounds or whatever. So can you just talk about how, obviously you can't undo all of that damage, but like, did you feel that you had an imperative to sort of course correct a little bit to be like, these are still people that deserve our respect? These are not community scapegoats.
Yeah, I think especially if you're linked to addiction or you're linked to prostitution and you end up the victim of a crime, that there is some around in the community who feel like because of those links that, well, what did you expect? You were kind of here, you were doing this, you were doing that. You were mingling with all this sordid group of people. How can you not expect to end up murdered? And I really wanted to show that despite the circumstances, that being the victim of a crime means that you should get the same respect across the board, regardless of gender, regardless of race, class, that every victim of violence should have the same opportunity to be reported on and covered and the case solved. And I will say, this book, I don't mean for it to be kind of a blanket excuse for anyone who has been impacted by substance abuse. I'm sure that there are readers who are victims of crime where the perpetrator was someone who was addicted at the time. And so I don't want the book to kind of feel like I'm taking, absolving anyone a responsibility, understanding that people who are addicted do commit crimes as well, that there are victims of crimes related to those circumstances. But I really wanted to show this group of women and keep it kind of in this capsule of who they were, but hopefully through journeying through their lives, people understand them more as the complex human beings they were, that they were someone's daughter, they were someone's mother, and hopefully that helps, paint a more complete portrait of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so on that note, what do you hope readers take away from this story? I know some authors don't love the concept of like the moral of the story, it ties everything up in a bow, but like, I guess what conversations do you hope your book generates among the people who read it?
Well, it is a difficult read, but I hope that readers face the pages. I tend to write stories that are a little bit on the darker side, but I don't do that for shock value. I really do that to bring awareness to certain circumstances. And I hope that readers, even though, there might be instances in the book that feel like they can't go on, I hope that they push themselves through because they're really reading it for the voices of the women to really understand who they are in this crime. And I think understanding who these women are can be applied across the board in several circumstances in our society. And so that's something that I really hope that readers take from this book is just understanding that it's important to read stories like this, no matter how dark and difficult. It's important to have that perspective so that we can kind of understand when these situations are applied in our own communities, how we can respond better to them.
That's a great answer. Honestly, I was just like, yes.
Yeah.
Does anyone out here in the audience have any questions? Submit them. We have time, so we can keep talking, or you can get your questions answered. Just giving everyone a little nudge there. I also liked the community nature of the story. Like, I think that's a really, the myth of American individualism has like seemed to slap us across the face really hard as a nation these days. And so the fact that you very much like these people are part of a community and this affects all of them in ways they may not even realize. Was that a goal of yours, or was it just, your experience being from Ohio, that's what you had known and you just kind of followed your gut?
Yeah, I think it was a mixture of both, but definitely heavy on following the gut. I think I was going back to many of those experiences when I was a kid where, playing on the road, and I knew what it meant to find a used syringe because it was just that type of community. I had drug traffickers as neighbors. And so I had the living in the community from both sides, from the side of my house was not coming from parents who were dealing with substance abuse, but I was playing with kids whose parents were. And so I had both of those experiences and perspectives. And that's definitely something I wanted to infuse in this story, was to show, this community as it is, and hopefully bringing in all sides.
Yeah, very important. Oh, I have a question. Are more of your novels already set to be published or sold?
So my next book that is definitely on contract is called The Wand Carriers. And readers might be surprised to learn this, but I write middle grade fantasy as well. And so this will be the first book in a series of books, and it will come out in autumn 2024. A lot of the books with the magical realm kind of deal with animal magic and whatnot. And so I really wanted to go into a book that's based on plant magic and kind of showing the importance of conservation, environmental themes, but setting it, in a fun, lighthearted, joyful, middle grade story. But I don't yet have an adult book on contract. I'm still kind of going back through the adult works to see which one feels like the next best story to follow on the Savage side.
Wow, I think that's so cool. Also, because your audience gets to grow with you. Like if those middle grade kids like you, they can discover your work as adults too.
Right.
Um,
Yep.
would you say that often you get more people who appreciate that you tackle tough themes in your work, or people who are like, man, it's just really dark, I don't like, people who seem to be like discouraged by it?
Definitely the latter. And I think it's consistently from the time I did my first book to this book, it's becoming more and more difficult to find readers who are willing to read this type of story. I don't know what that means for the future of these types of stories. I think reading taste have just changed. There's a lot of individuals who they have several different triggers, and it's very difficult for them to face these stories. And I completely understand that, because it has to be based on personal preference and whether you can, for your mental health, really go through these types of stories. But I hope, for folks who are just kind of turned away from stories in general, where it's not necessarily something that they're triggered by, but just something where they don't want to read something that's a little bit on the darker side, I would encourage folks, to kind of keep this type of storytelling alive. Again, I think it's important to explore this side of life, explore these stories from people who are often silenced. But yeah, it's definitely on the latter. I mean, there's several, with each book that comes out, I've noticed the reviews are, I just can't finish this book, or this is too dark, I can't read it. And so I don't know. It's kind of difficult to say. I think it definitely impacts the way I look at my future books. I definitely question, will readers stick with this story? And so, it's impacting publishing, it's impacting authors in terms of what we're releasing. But I hope that these stories, I hope that when readers look at these stories, like with Betty, that was a difficult read, hopefully understanding generational abuse within families, and with this story, reading it for the women and understanding, what they might have gone through in life. So, but it's definitely the latter.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that that's even as a bookseller, it's kind of a hard thing. Is like, the world is burning down all around us, and so people are looking for escapism. And so I find it's a hard sell if you like even acknowledge that, like, well, it's not the easiest read, and then people are like, no, I'll do that later.
Right. Yeah.
So I feel you there.
Yeah.
Oh, we have a comment from a viewer named Jane, and she actually asked the first question. She wants to let you know that Betty was her favorite book she read in 2020, and she also very much enjoyed your first book.
Oh,
So,
gosh. Well, thank you so much. Yes, I'm so happy to hear that. And thank you for sticking with me for all three books. I really appreciate that.
what was the process for you, like, getting published initially? Was it, pretty quick, or was it, like a journey to find an agent and then find the right publisher? I'm always super interested in the different paths people take.
Oh, yeah. So when the Summer That Melted Everything got published, I had been on the journey for a little over 10 years. And Betty was my first book that I ever wrote, and it was the first book that I went published. And so for all those years, I was trying to get a foot in the publishing door with Betty. The feedback I was getting was, oh, this is way too female, take out menstruation, and he mentioned of bras, it's going to make readers uncomfortable. I was told by several people to, turn Betty into a boy because they sell better. Boy narrators just sell better. One agent told me I could write the Huckleberry Finn in my generation if I just changed Betty into a boy. And this was before the Me Too movement. And so, I had feedback of there's no way more than one woman in a family would experience sexual abuse because they would all talk about it. And so after the Me Too movement happened, people were more educated, especially on generational sexual abuse and how it's a crime that's committed under the cloak of silence. These women and oftentimes girls are not talking about it. And so I'd actually heard change Betty into a boy so many times that I looked at the other books I had written, and I had The Summer That Melted Everything, which was a boy narrator. And I put that on submission, and it sold in a month. So that can kind of tell you the appetite of the industry after over 10 years of trying to get Betty published. That one sold in a month. And so that was definitely how that first book got published. And then after the Me Too movement happened, publishers were more willing to look at stories like Betty that covered generational sexual abuse and kind of championing a young girl's coming of age. And so it was, by the time I wrote Betty to the time Betty got published, it was 2 decades. So it was a long time.
Wow. I mean, I shouldn't be surprised because I've heard these same things from other authors, and it's just like, but like, good for you for persevering. It's like it takes a very strong type of person to do that. So that's really cool to hear.
Okay.
And that you have all of these projects that you've worked on, like, I don't know, something of mine gets rejected and I'm like, I need 2 weeks before I can even approach words again. So yeah, that's really, really cool.
Yeah, you got to hang in there for sure. I always tell writers who reach out, how can I get published? I just say you've got to definitely persevere, not take any of the rejections personally. I know a lot of writers will keep their rejections. I never did. I just, got rid of them. But yeah, you definitely have to persevere, keep going, and it will happen. For some people, it's an overnight thing. For other people, it's a little bit longer haul. So just stick in there for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's also like, I really think it's cool when I hear authors talk about, you got all that feedback and you could have done what they wanted and I'm sure they would have bought it, but like something inside of you said, no, this is not the right idea. Like, I would rather wait for the right opportunity. And I think I don't know, could you speak about like, where do you find that voice that you listen to?
Yeah, well, I think, especially with a book like Betty, I had done interviews with my mother, Betty, and the living family members like Mama Alka and my aunts, Frey and Flossie. And, they were women who experienced sexual abuse. In the case of my Mama Alka, she had been abused by her father and her brothers for the time she was a little girl, and so much abuse that she actually thought it was a normal part of life. It's one of the reasons why she says she never talked about it, was she thought it was something that every daughter experienced. And so you can kind of imagine her as a kid looking out at the other houses in the neighborhood thinking, oh, that little girl is kind of experiencing the same thing. And so when you have those firsthand accounts of people who have experienced that and you're interviewing them, it really does an injustice and a disservice to them to kind of throw their story away and to say, oh, this didn't happen. And so I'm just kind of broad brush this in order to get published. I'm going to kind of create the story that publishers and agents want. And so that was important to me, that those stories are preserved, as they were told to me, and that, this type of story, even if we have to kind of fight for its presence on the shelf, that it's a story that lives there. And it wasn't, I think it's probably what many female writers face. When I was starting out, I was told, you want to use initials. Your name, Tiffany, is very fluffy. And, you won't be taken seriously. If you want to write serious literary fiction. With my fantasy, I had wanted to publish that for a long time, but I was told, stay in your lane, stay literary fiction. If you write anything else, you won't be taken seriously. And so, I'm at a point in my career now where I want to, publish everything I want to write. And, if someone like Stephen King or James Patterson can write kids' books and write adult books and still be taken as seriously within their genre, I do think a woman writer should have the same opportunity to kind of explore, various different genres. And so, it's definitely something that, even my author photo, the first author photo I took, that was probably about the fourth or fifth author photo I had to submit. I was told my first photo, I look too young. I look like a schoolgirl. Take another one. Oh, you look too angry in this one. Readers will not connect to you. Do a little bit of smile. I was given this whole portfolio of female writers with just the right amount of smile. If you smile too much, you were romance. If you smiled very little, you were difficult. But if you smiled enough, you kind of hit the literary fiction balance. And so in that first photo, I'm really frowning because you kind of see my anger at being told that my first photo wasn't enough. And so it's just all these different wheels in publishing working. And I think it's getting better, but it's certainly not there yet.
Yeah, no, and that intersection between like your work being an extension of who you are and like getting feedback on it and people expecting you to just like not take it personally, but like when it's something like a photo and they're like, oh, you're scowling, part
Yeah.
of you goes, well, this is my face.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
I can't change that. But I really think it like what I appreciate about, your writing that I've read is that you're not afraid to shy away from these difficult topics, but in a way that is very like uh you're just informing people that like this is someone's lived reality. And like I get that it may be hard, take as long as you need to read it, but like it doesn't make it go away.
Right.
Um
Yeah.
and I never have felt like it's always done with respect and compassion. And I think that's such a fine line to toe. So I commend you for that because, especially in the last couple of years in, national politics, there's been this sort of sensationalistic view of like the opioid crisis, the working class, and all these things. And it's like, it does a disservice to those people because they still have to live that reality when the news cameras leave their town.
Right. Yeah. And I will say, the drug epidemic I know is kind of coming into light recently, but, like my aunts, uncles, and cousins have been dealing with addiction back to the 1940s and 1950s. I lost several members to overdoses. And so it's been a part of this community, even if it hasn't been in kind of the national news. It's been a part of this community for decades. And I definitely, you put it so beautifully that this is someone's lived life. And, we kind of owe it to them not to turn away from this. And I couldn't have said that better myself, too. It's not to write this stuff for kind of shock value. There's a scene in the book, for example, between Ark and what happens to her when she's a little girl. And, I don't go into those details of what happens, but I just give enough to let readers understand what is happening. And I think finding that balance between not doing it for any sort of shock reaction, but doing it in order to show the complex nature of everything that goes into an individual's life. That's the goal. And definitely, these people wear this life. It's not a shirt that they can kind of take off and change into another shirt. It's really the life that they have. And I think we owe it to people to read these types of stories. And hopefully through that understanding and compassion and knowledge, we can start to create instances in the system where especially children of these households are better protected.
Yeah. And I mean, on that topic, it's like, fiction is a way to help people realize that like you're not the only one who experiences this. So, for for a teenager to find it in a library, that's like a really powerful resource to put out there.
Yeah, and that actually goes back to Betty. And so my father is white, so I'm very fair skinned. I never experienced racism that my mother did, but I received so many emails from individuals who have been like my mother who faced racism and they felt like they didn't have the opportunity to be seen or heard. And stories like Betty, they said that they felt like they were finally seen, that they were finally heard. And so that's kind of the ultimate goal of these stories, is to represent people who are voiceless and to hopefully make them feel like they do matter, they are valued, no matter how you identify, no matter how your race, your culture, your religion, that you're important, your voice matters. And that's kind of the ultimate goal of these books.
Yeah. Well, I can't think of a better way to wrap this up unless someone else has another question. I think this has been an absolute delight and a wonderful conversation. Okay, well, I guess let's close it on out. Um, Thank you, Tiffany, for joining us on At Home at Literati this afternoon. And thank you to our viewers as well. Make sure to buy the book. The link is in the chat on the event listing that brought you here. And of course, you can always come into our store. You might even run into me. Thanks for your support, and we will see you at the next event.
Oh, gosh, thank you so much, guys. It was a pleasure. And so was speaking with you. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Tiffany. I had a great time.
Take care.
Bye.